Hi, crime enthusiasts. This is your host, Ishita, and for my first case in this podcast, I have chosen the case of Jack the Ripper. It's one of the most fascinating serial killer stories of all time. In 1888, the Whitechapel district of London was terrorized by a series of gruesome murders attributed to a figure known as Jack the Ripper. All of his known victims were women. However, determining the exact number of his victims remained a challenge as Jack the Ripper was never apprehended, leaving much of the case shrouded in mystery to this day. The Whitechapel area in London at that time was rampant disease, crime, and poverty. Life was a battle for people who lived. Whether you were an immigrant or local, life was treacherous in these slums. It is estimated that out of over 450,000 residents in East End, approximately 1,200 women were working as sex workers during the time Jack the Ripper began his killing spree. Jobs were scarce, forcing many women to turn to sex work for survival. Whitechapel's maze like layout, with its twisting alleys and dimly lit narrow passageways, offered the killer plenty of opportunities to evade capture. This was further complicated by the rudimentary tools available to the police. Criminology and forensic science were still in their infancy, leaving investigators with limited means to identify or track the murderer. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was a 43-year-old woman standing just 5 feet tall. Mary's life had been anything but ordinary. Once married to a printer, she had 5 children, but their marriage was anything but stable. Her father accused her husband of infidelity, while her husband claimed Mary's battle with alcohol caused her to abandon her family. The strain eventually led to their separation. For a while, Mary worked at the Lambeth workhouse, but that chapter ended and she found herself living in a woman's common lodging house. On the fateful night of August 31st, 1888, around 2:30 a.m., she was last seen leaving the Frying Pan pub. At 3:30 a.m., a delivery driver on his way to work came across what appeared to be a discarded bundle on the street. As he drew closer, he realized it was the body of a woman. Unsure, he called out to another man walking behind him, and then the two men informed the first constable that they encountered. When the police constable arrived at the scene, he discovered something that the two men hadn't noticed. The woman's throat had been slit. Soon after, the doctor arrived to examine the body, and it was later taken to the morgue. This marked the first murder of a sex worker by Jack the Ripper. Well, now that Jack had claimed his first victim, he was ready for another. And let me warn you, listeners, the murders from here on out will be disturbingly gruesome. Annie Chapman, born in 1841, once lived with her husband, John Chapman, working for a wealthy couple. However, Annie's escalating drinking problem eventually led to the couple's separation and she moved to London to start anew. She found accommodation at Crossingham's lodging house, where she paid 8 pence a night for a double bed. Like many women in the area, Annie supplemented her modest income from crochet work and making artificial flowers by turning to prostitution. At one point, she had a violent altercation with another lodger, Eliza Cooper, which escalated into a public fight at the Britannia pub on the corner of Dorset Street. Despite the trouble she faced, Annie's last days were spent in physical pain and rapid deterioration of her health. On the 7th of September, Annie encountered her friend Amelia on Dorset Street. Pale and exhausted, Annie complained of feeling too ill to do anything. Her final words to Amelia were, "I want to pull myself together and get some money, or I shall have no lodgings." The next morning, just before 6 a.m. on September 8th, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street descended the stairs, walked through the narrow passageway, and opened the back door. What he saw made him recoil in horror. Annie's mutilated body lay between the steps and the wooden fence, her head turned toward the house. Her clothes were pulled up above her waist, revealing her red and white striped stockings. A handkerchief was tightly bound around her throat. Her abdomen had been viciously sliced open, and her intestines were removed, draped over her shoulder. Her uterus was missing, along with parts of her bladder and vagina. The killer had most likely taken the organs. The inspector arrived shortly after and immediately ordered that nobody touch the body until the doctor had completed the post-mortem examination. Upon examining the victim, the doctor noted that the murderer must have gripped her chin to tilt her head back, allowing them to make a clean incision across her throat. Her swollen face and extended tongue suggested that she had been suffocated before the throat was slashed. The cuts themselves were remarkably clean and precise, indicating a high level of skill. Whoever did this, Dr. Phillips speculated, has a fair amount of anatomical knowledge. This could be the work of a doctor or perhaps a surgeon. In such a poorly lit environment, it would be extremely difficult for someone without expertise to make such precise cuts. By now, with Chapman being the second victim, a pattern was beginning to emerge. The killer's modus operandi and ritual, what experts refer to as a signature, were becoming clearer. For those less familiar with serial killer terminology, this signature is the consistent way the crimes are committed, offering a chilling glimpse into the mind of the killer. What we know now is Jack's hunting grounds were the slums of East London. He ventured out at late night, dressed in dark, inconspicuous clothing, using the shadows to his advantage. His victims were exclusively sex workers. Why do you think this was the case? Perhaps Jack harbored a deep hatred for sex workers, possibly stemming from a troubled childhood. Maybe he had a strong resentment towards women, perhaps influenced by a negative relationship with his mother, possibly even a sex worker herself, reflecting a broken home. In 1888, a century later, several researchers, including the FBI, outlined the characteristics of Jack the Ripper. He was likely a loner, someone who was never accountable to anyone, and he probably didn't have a family. He would carry out his brutal acts late at night, stalking his victims. His background likely placed him in the lower economic class, and he either lived or worked in Whitechapel, committing the murders close to home. He was employed Monday to Friday, possibly in a job that involved working with corpses, such as a butcher, a mortician's assistant, a medical examiner's aide, or a hospital attendant. Jobs that would have given him knowledge of human anatomy. While these factors shed light on the possible motivations and backgrounds of Jack the Ripper, there may be additional influences and experiences that shaped his disturbed mental state, driving him to commit such horrific crimes. On 27 September 1888, a newspaper office received a letter supposedly from the killer, boasting about how the police couldn't catch him and claiming that he would continue killing sex workers. The letter was signed Jack, marking the first time the name Jack the Ripper appeared. The newspaper shared this letter with the police at Scotland Yard. Around this time, a new investigator rose through the ranks, Inspector Frederick George Aberlin, who patrol the Whitechapel area for 14 years. He was assigned to take charge of the on the ground investigation into the Jack the Ripper case. Abilene quickly began questioning people in the area, including butchers and bootmakers. On September 10, 1888, a man named John Pizer was arrested after being found with a leather apron and suspected of threatening several sex workers. He arrested a man named John Pizer after being found with a leather apron and suspected of threatening several sex workers. He had a prior conviction for a stabbing offense, and police interrogated him about his whereabouts on the night of August 31st. However, Pizer was cleared after his alibi was confirmed. The press began to criticize the police for their handling of the case, pointing out that had the crimes occurred in a wealthier area like Mayfair, they would have received much more attention. This was the first time such grisly crimes were brought into the public eye, and the media was captivated by the story. In an unusual turn, a bold reporter even dressed up as a woman to lure the killer out of the shadows. Meanwhile, angry citizens formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, determined to take matters into their own hands. On Sunday, September 30th, 1888, the Ripper struck again, committing a double murder. His first victim that night was Elizabeth Stride, attacked in a courtyard next to the International Working Men's Educational Club on Berners Street. Elizabeth Stride was born in 1843 on a small farm in Sweden. At 17, she moved to Gothenburg, where she worked as a maid and caretaker for children. By 23, she turned to sex work. In 1869, she married a man, John, and they started a small business, but their marriage was rocky, and by 1881 it ended. Stride then moved to Whitechapel and began staying at a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. Around 11 p.m., two men noticed Stride sheltering in the doorway of the Bricklayer's Arm on Seattle Street. She was with a man who was about 5.5 feet tall, kissing and hugging her. The man seemed respectably dressed, and the two were surprised by the public affection between them. At around 11:45 p.m., William Marshall, a laborer who lived at 64 Berners Street, saw the same man and woman outside number 63. They appeared sober and began kissing. Marshall overheard the man telling the woman, "You would say anything but your prayers." The couple then moved to Dutfield's yard. The key witness to see Elizabeth Stride in the half hour before her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard was a Hungarian Jew. At around 12:45 a.m., Schwartz turned onto Berners Street and noticed a man walking ahead of him. The man stopped to talk to a woman standing at the gateway of Dutfield's yard. Schwartz later confirmed that the woman he saw was Elizabeth Stride. At 1 a.m. on September 38th, Louis D. M. Schwartz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, made a gruesome discovery. He saw a woman lying in the ground in the courtyard with a stream of blood running from her throat and flowing towards the door of the club. The Ripper had slit her throat, severing the windpipe. The mutilation, however, was minimal, as he was interrupted by the entrance of a carriage into the yard. The doctor later confirmed that the blood was still flowing from her throat when she was found, suggesting that she may have been killed moments before being discovered. It's chilling to consider that Jack could have watched his victim slowly die from the corner of the street, waiting for the perfect moment to escape after committing such a horrific act. Later that same night, Catherine Eddowes became the Ripper's next victim. Just hours before her murder, around 8:30 p.m., she had entertained a crowd outside number 29 Aldgate Street with a drunken, impromptu imitation of a fire engine. After her performance, she took a bow and then collapsed on the pavement. The police picked her up and took her to Bishopgate Station, where she was held until 1 a.m., just hours before she met her tragic fate at the hands of Jack the Ripper. At 1:30 a.m. on September 38, P.C. Watkins of the City Police was patrolling his usual beat, which took him through Mitre Square every 12 to 14 minutes. As he passed the southeast corner of the square, he noticed a man and woman talking quietly together. The woman had her back to him, but her hand rested on the man's chest. Watkins immediately had a suspicion that something wasn't right. At 1:44 a.m., P.C. Watkins turned off Leadenhall Street and made his way along Mitre Street, heading into Mitre Square. Almost immediately, he was struck by a sight that sent him reeling back in horror. He raced to find a nearby night watchman to report what he had just. Catherine Eddowes was lying on her back in a pool of blood, her clothes haphazardly thrown up over her waist. Her body was gruesomely mutilated. Her head was placed near a coal hole, her stomach slashed open, and her entrails were ripped out and flung around her body. Some of them appeared to be lying near her neck. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that her face was unrecognizable. No one who had known her in life would have been able to identify her by her face. An officer who had been in the force for years later recalled, "I have been in the force for a long while, but I have never saw such a sight." The body had been mutilated beyond belief, far worse than any of Jack's previous victims. Her throat was slit, her abdomen torn open, and her intestines dropped over her shoulder. A piece of her intestine had been placed by her side, and her left kidney, along with most of her uterus, had been removed. Her face was disfigured beyond recognition. The brutality of the crime indicated that Jack had ample time to carry out his horrific work. After the body was taken to the morgue, police discovered a disturbing clue. A fragment of her apron had been taken by the killer, and the missing piece was later found at 2:55 a.m. that morning. The apron fragment was the only real piece of evidence Jack the Ripper left behind, offering us a glimpse into his intentions and behavior as he fled the scene of his latest atrocity. By this point, it was crucial to understand the sheer brutality and speed of Jack the Ripper's actions. After each of his killings, there was an overwhelming amount of blood, enough to drench his clothes in the aftermath. What's even more disturbing is the speed at which he carried out these crimes. The journey from Mitre Square to Gurston Street would just take under 10 minutes at a brisk pace. Yet, only 45 minutes passed between his first and second kills on September 38th. Jack was on a mission, driven by an animalistic compulsion to kill, a hunger that he seemed determined to satisfy at any cost. After the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body, it was evident that he was becoming bolder, more reckless, and willing to take more risks. His need to kill had taken on a life of its own, guiding his every move. The crime scene of his second victim that night, Catherine Eddowes, had something that the first did not, a clue that authorities initially overlooked. Eddowes' body was discovered near the Wentworth dwellings, a housing complex predominantly inhabited by Jewish immigrants. What made this location particularly significant was the discovery of a chilling message written on the building's black bricks. "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." This disturbing message quickly caught the attention of the police, who were aware of the anti Semitic sentiments that had already been staked that had already been stoked by the leather apron scare. The Wentworth dwellings sat in the heart of a largely Jewish neighborhood, with most of its residents being Jewish. The police understood the risk. If the message were left unaddressed, it could fuel racial unrest, potentially inciting violence against the Jewish community in Whitechapel. Fearing the repercussions, the police swiftly had the message removed, hoping to prevent a larger crisis. At this point, Jack the Ripper had claimed 4 victims, and the panic in London was palpable. With each murder, his violence grew more methodical and the city was gripped by terror. The hunt for the killer intensified, but so did the fear, as every corner of Whitechapel seemed to conceal a dark, deadly secret. A letter was sent to the Central News Office, addressed to the boss, was indeed a chilling piece of correspondence. At first, the police was skeptical, thinking it might be just a hoax. However, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the very day the letter arrived made it impossible for the authorities to dismiss it. The boastful tone, combined with the claim, "I want to get to work right away if I get a chance," seemed to align with the killer's actions, and the police had to take the letter more seriously. The correspondence solidified the infamous name, Jack the Ripper, forever tied to the gruesome murders that had shaken London. Despite the compelling evidence, no one was ever convicted of these crimes, but the case has had a long lasting impact. The investigation and the terrifying nature of the murders contributed to the emergence of the concept of the modern serial killer. The conditions of life in the East End of London during the 19th century were grueling, with poverty and disease rampant. Many East End children didn't survive past their 5th birthday, and it was not unusual for mothers to send their children into the streets late at night while they worked as prostitutes to make ends meet. These harsh conditions, alongside the extreme deprivation, likely shaped the psychological environment of the time and may have contributed to the formation of what we now understand as the first modern serial killer. The question remains, what drives a person to commit such heinous acts? Was it the crushing poverty, the trauma of growing up in such a brutal environment, or something deeper? It's a complex question without a clear answer, but the circumstances of the time certainly played a role in shaping the social and psychological conditions that allowed such a killer to emerge. What do you think? What factors might have turned a man into a monster like Jack the Ripper? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on this unsettling case. Also, as this is my first episode, I would love to hear your feedback and thoughts. Feel free to let me know what other crimes you would like me to cover in future episodes. Don't forget to subscribe to my podcast on Spotify and YouTube to stay updated. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have an amazing week ahead. Until then, stay safe, crime enthusiasts, and don't wander into dark alleys alone.